The snow was falling in long, heavy curtains the morning Jonah McGraw rode down from the ridges. His horse's hooves sank deep into the drifts that had piled overnight, and every breath from the animal rose in white plumes, quick to vanish against the pale sky. Jonah's beard was crusted with frost, his shoulders stiff beneath the weight of a thick hide coat. He was a man carved from the silence of the mountains, a figure that seemed more at home among pines and granite than among windows and lamplight. Yet today he came riding into town, alone as he often did when supplies ran thin. A man like Jonah rarely lingered. He'd ride in, trade furs, take flour and salt, a little coffee, then ride back before the town's noise settled beneath his skin. But that morning, he would later remember it like a memory carved into stone. Something shifted. At the far end of the street, near the steps of the general store, a young woman sat with her shawl pulled tight against the bitter wind. She did not belong to the ragged line of drunks and drifters who sometimes haunted the edge of town. There was something finer about her, even in her ruin. Her boots, though worn thin, had once been of good leather. Her hands, cupped together for warmth, still bore the thin glint of a wedding band. Jonah reined in his horse without meaning to. The sight of her arrested him as surely as if the cold had turned his blood to ice. She wasn't shouting or crying for mercy. Her voice, low and steady, carried only to those who drew close. "Ma'am, if you've bread to spare. Sir, only a crust if you can." Each passerby hurried along, some whispering, some sneering outright. From his saddle, Jonah caught the mutter of Martha Kincaid, who ran the store. She ought to go back where she came from. Town can't feed every runaway bride who stumbles through. Behind her, Jeb Tanner, a ranch hand with too much time and too little grace, snorted loud enough for the girl to hear. Man must have seen enough of her by the wedding night. Hightailed it before the vows cooled. Laughter. Quick, sharp, meant to sting. The girl did not look at them. She lifted her chin as though dignity alone might shield her from the cold. But Jonah saw her eyes, clear, wide, and brimming with the kind of shame that can hollow a soul. He felt something shift in him then, old and painful. A memory like an ember stirred. He remembered what it was to stand in the middle of people and feel smaller than dust, to be judged and cast aside for reasons half true and half cruel. Jonah swung down from his horse. He moved without words, his boots crunching through snow as he stepped into the warmth of the store. Inside, the smell of coffee beans and kerosene lamps greeted him. Jonah placed his usual order: flour, salt, tobacco, beans. Then, after a pause, he added a loaf of bread, a small sack of dried apples, and a strip of jerky. Martha raised a brow. "That's more than you usually take. Add it to my bill." His voice was steady, quiet. When Jonah stepped back outside, the girl was still there, her thin shawl no match for the cutting wind. Without ceremony, he placed the small bundle into her hands. He did not linger with his eyes, only nodded once, as though this were an ordinary thing. Her lips parted. Pride held her for a heartbeat too long, but hunger broke through. She clutched the food, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the snow. Jonah tipped his hat, turned, and mounted his horse again. He felt the heat of the town stairs even as the cold bit harder. Behind him, whispers swelled, a mountain man and a disgraced bride. But Jonah rode out of earshot before their voices could anchor in him. That evening, the whispers traveled farther than the snow. At the saloon, over cheap whiskey, Jeb Tanner painted his picture of her. Pretty thing but already tossed aside. Now she's begging on the street. Wouldn't be surprised if she ends up at the saloon's back room before week's end. The laughter was ugly, and the Reverend Josiah Pike, who drank only coffee but enjoyed the company of wagging tongues, shook his head with practiced sorrow. Some women invite ruin upon themselves. God sees. Her name was Mary Beth Colton. A few women in town remembered the ceremony not 2 months past. A drifter with fine promises had stood beside her in lace, swearing he had land and prospects in Colorado. He vanished before the ink on the marriage lines was dry. Some said he ran from debt. Others that he'd planned it all along. Either way, Mary Beth was left in the cold, with no family, no coin, and the town's judgment poured over her like boiling tar. By nightfall, she had found her way to the church steps. Reverend Pike left her outside with a sermon about atonement through suffering. Inside, the candles burned warm. Outside, the snow thickened, falling soft as ash. Jonah had made camp on the edge of town that night. He sat by a small fire, his horse tethered nearby, the silence thick around him. But he couldn't shake the image of her, Mary Beth's hands trembling as she held the bread, the way her pride and desperation warred across her face. He knew hunger well. He knew shame better. The flames popped, sending sparks skyward, but the warmth did not reach the hollow ache inside him. He stared at the dark horizon of the town, where lamplight glowed faintly against the snow, and wondered if by morning the girl would still be breathing. He lay down on his bedroll, the fur cloak pulled over him, but sleep came slow and restless. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw her again, small, bent against the wind, chin lifted like someone trying to remember how dignity once felt. The snow fell harder, muffling the world until the only sound was the crackle of the dying fire and the whisper of memory in Jonah's chest. And in that silence, something long buried in him stirred awake. Morning came pale and merciless. The storm had not broken, and the snow lay deeper in the ruts of the street, muffling every hoofbeat and bootfall. Jonah rose stiff from his bedroll, the fire long gone, and saddled his horse. He had meant to leave town as he always did, to ride back into the high country where judgment did not follow. But something dragged at him, a weight in his chest. He turned his horse not toward the mountains but back into town. The street was hushed, smoke rising from chimneys and thin plumes. Near the church steps, just where he had feared, Mary Beth Colton sat huddled in her shawl, her skin pale as the snow itself. Her lips moved as if in prayer, though no one lingered to hear. Jonah dismounted without thought. He crouched beside her, saw how weakly her breath steamed the air. "You'll freeze here," he said, voice low but steady. She blinked up at him, shame flickering in her gaze. "I've nowhere else." Jonah did not argue. He pulled her gently to her feet, steadying her against his arm, and guided her through the empty street. People watched from behind curtains and a few from doorways, whispers already rising. The mountain man was leading the fallen bride. He did not care. On the edge of town, he had rented a small cabin from the stable master for the night. It was little more than a square box with a stove, but it held fire and 4 walls, and that was more than she had. Inside, the air was sharp with cold, but Jonah struck a match and coaxed flame into the stove. Soon the warmth began to spread. Mary Beth sat stiffly on the edge of the narrow bed, her shawl still clutched tight. "I can't stay here," she whispered. They'll think what they like," Jonah said. "Let them." Her eyes filled, though she did not let the tears fall. "I can't repay this." "You will," Jonah said simply, setting a pot on the stove. "In your own way. In your own time." For a long while, there was only the crackle of fire and the hiss of snow against the roof. Jonah busied himself with coffee and beans. Mary Beth sat in silence, hands folded, shoulders slowly loosening as the warmth seeped into her bones. In the days that followed, they found a rhythm. Jonah carved at pieces of wood with his knife, shaping handles and toys with a craftsman's patience. Mary Beth mended torn seams in his coat, her fingers quick despite the weariness that clung to her. They spoke little, but the silences were not empty. They were filled with small gestures, her pouring his coffee before her own, him adjusting the blanket over her shoulders when the night turned bitter. Yet outside the cabin the town's whispers grew louder. One morning, as Mary Beth stepped out to fetch water from the well, Reverend Pike cornered her. His tall frame loomed in his dark coat, his voice low but sharp. "You shame yourself, child. Running from one man into the arms of another. You'll find no redemption in sin." Mary Beth's jaw tightened. "He has given me nothing but shelter." "Shelter is not free," Pike hissed. "This town has eyes. God has eyes. Best you remember." Jonah appeared then, carrying split logs across his shoulder. He did not raise his voice, only set the wood down and looked at the Reverend with a steadiness that stilled the air. "She owes no one an account," Jonah said. "Not you. Not them. Not even me." For a moment, Pike faltered. The townsfolk nearby had gone silent, watching. Jonah's calm refusal was harder to argue with than rage. The Reverend's lips thinned and he stepped back. "Sin will find you, mountain man." "Then it will have to climb," Jonah said simply. Mary Beth said nothing, but when they were alone again, her hands trembled as she poured water into the basin. Jonah noticed, but he did not speak of it. He simply set a hand on the table, close enough for her to steady herself if she wished. For a moment, her fingers hovered, then settled briefly against his before pulling back. That night, over the quiet crackle of the stove, Mary Beth spoke at last of her past. "I thought marriage would give me a name," she said, voice barely more than a thread. "A place. But he left me before I had time to belong anywhere. And now I am worse than nameless. I am unwanted." Jonah studied the flames, then spoke slowly as if each word carried the weight of years. "I once had a place. A wife. Lad. Illness took her, debt took the land, and shame drove me from the rest. I came here because the mountains ask no questions." Mary Beth's eyes softened. You carry that still. He did not deny it. The silence that followed was heavy but not suffocating. At last she reached across the table, her hand brushing his rough knuckles, not seeking comfort but offering it. It was the first time either of them had reached without restraint. But the town was not done with them. Jeb Tanner, restless for entertainment, began to stir the fire. He spoke loudly in the saloon of Mary Beth, shacking up with the mountain man. Soon others repeated it. By the end of the week, her name was spoken only in whispers and pitying shakes of the head. One afternoon, as Jonah loaded supplies onto his horse, Jeb swaggered up, smirk curling. She's a fine-looking thing, McGraw. Shame she fell so low. Tell you what, when you tire of her, send her my way. I don't mind a bit of second hand. The words landed like a lash. The crowd waited for Jonah to erupt, to throw fists. Instead, Jonah's face remained calm, his eyes steady on Jeb until the smirk faltered. You'll watch your mouth, Jonah said quietly. She's worth 10 of you. He turned away before Jeb could answer, but Mary Beth, who had heard every word, felt the sting burrow deep. No matter Jonah's defense, the shame was heavier than she could bear. That evening, she slipped from the cabin into the falling snow, shawl tight, determined to vanish rather than be the weight that dragged him into scorn. But the cold was merciless and hunger gnawed. By the time she reached the general store, her body gave way. She collapsed into the drift, the world dimming into white silence. Jonah found her there, face pale against the snow, lashes dusted with frost. The townsfolk had gathered, watching, whispering, none daring to move. Jonah pushed through them, knelt, and lifted her into his arms. She stirred faintly, lips trembling with half-formed words. He did not speak. His actions spoke louder. He carried her high against his chest, every eye on him, every whisper silenced. The mountain man and the fallen bride, together in the open, unashamed. The moment burned into the town's memory. Not a fight, not a sermon, but a man choosing quietly before all of them, to bear her weight and her shame as his own. Back in the cabin, Jonah laid her near the fire, wrapping her in furs. Slowly, color returned to her cheeks. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to tears. You should have left me, she whispered. I don't leave what I've chosen to keep, Jonah said. The words were simple, unadorned, but they rooted deep. Mary Beth turned her face into the fur, tears slipping silently, not of shame this time but of release. When at last she looked up, her gaze held his without flinching. Jonah set another log on the fire. The crackle filled the silence, steady, promising. He did not reach for her hand, but when hers slid across the blanket to find his, he did not pull away. They sat like that, the storm raging outside, while in the cabin a different warmth took hold. The days that followed were quieter. The town still gossiped, but something in Jonah's defiance had blunted their cruelty. Whispers did not bite as sharply when spoken against a man who had already chosen his stand. Mary Beth began to walk the town again, not with bowed head but with steady steps. Some still turned away but others softened. Martha Kincaid, who once muttered against her, now slipped an extra roll into her hand with a gruff, "On the house." Change did not come quickly, but it came. One evening, as firelight painted the cabin walls gold, Jonah looked across the table at Mary Beth. She was darning his glove, the lamplight glinting in her hair. You belong here, he said softly. Her hands stilled. She lifted her eyes, searching his. He did not add more, did not adorn the truth. He simply let it rest between them. For the first time she smiled, not forced, not thin, but true. The snow fell long into spring that year, but inside the cabin a fire burned steady. Two souls once discarded had found not rescue but recognition. Not grand passion but quiet belonging. And if the town spoke, let them. The mountains asked no questions and neither did Jonah. He had chosen. She had accepted. That was enough.